time to talk about the Washington Observer's recent hit piece on Loren Culp and their previous articles about Maia Espinoza and some other things regarding Washington State. Hey, what's going on Facebook Live? I wanted to do a quick stream here and talk about this recent hit piece that came across my feed. This article from the Washington Observer. They have a website over on Substack, and it says, Culp's campaign looks like a long con. And you can see here this guy, Paul Query, who is the editor and publisher of the Washington Observer, says the Culp campaign looks like a long con. Shadowy consultant rides off to Vegas with at least 10% of the $3 million raised. And I can tell you, as somebody who recently ran for office here in the 2020 season, I'm a political newcomer. I've never ran for an office before. And in my building my campaign and looking for people to assist, whether you're hiring somebody to do your finances and do all your financial filings, or if you're looking at a campaign manager or somebody to assist with fundraising, whatever it is, even if it's just a publicist, somebody to build your signs and order your signs for you, people take a piece of every little part of the campaign. So if you end up raising money for your campaign manager might very well take a part of those funds as part of their agreement, and it's kind of a commission-based thing where if you succeed, they succeed. So if you raise more money, they will in turn get more money at the end of the campaign. And he says here, imagine if you're a hustling conservative political consultant looking for his next gig. Now imagine that a small-town police chief suddenly becomes a hero of the gun rights movement, and then imagine that chief decides to run for governor as a Republican. In a blue state where the GOP has the same chance in 2020 as an ice cube in a blast furnace. Now, I don't think that's true. And we've had more, this year, I think we had more energy and more excitement around the campaign season than any previous year that I've ever been tuned in to the political scene here in Washington State. And he goes on and says, sounds like a loser, right? Who wants to spend a year beating his head against a structural disadvantage and walk away with a double-digit loss on his record? Well, what if it wasn't about winning at all? What if it was all about the money? And he goes on to talk about you have different kinds of campaigns. You have a campaign that can be win or lose, a head-to-head campaign. You have a campaign like Jay Inslee's where you're just positioned to win no matter what. Everybody who looks at it says you're going to win no matter what. And then you have a campaign that's structured to lose, a loser campaign. And so he says it's all about just making money. And I'm not a guy who wore any Culp hats. I'm not a guy who was waving Culp signs or anything like that. I sure joined a lot of the Culp train campaign events because I wanted to go and wave my own signs within my district and get the word out for my own campaign. But I wasn't a big supporter of Loren Culp. I actually voted for Joshua Freed in the primary, and I really advocated for Joshua Freed to be the nominee because I thought he had the best chance of winning. But Loren Culp actually won me over when I met him at an event in Bellevue where I shook his hand. He asked me about my campaign, and I have to say that guy really felt like a genuine, like he was really genuinely interested in how my campaign was going, and he was genuinely interested in what I had to say. And I really felt like Loren Culp would be a really good fit in the governor's office, that we really needed somebody who would represent Washingtonians and would stand up for our rights and for our Constitution, and I felt like Loren Culp was the guy. But this guy, Paul Query, I don't know if that's his real name or not, but he goes down the line here and talks about how the Culp campaign got involved with Christopher Gurgin, the campaign manager that previously ran the campaign for Donald Trump in Oregon. And he talks about how this guy took a beating and lost in Oregon in 2016, lost the Trump campaign to Oregon. And I have to think that Donald Trump really wasn't playing to win the popular vote. He wasn't playing to win places like Oregon and Washington. He was playing a different game. to win the Electoral College, and that's the game that he won in 2016. And so whether or not the campaign in Oregon for Donald Trump in 2016 was a success or not, it's probably up for debate. But he talks about how this guy has a quote or a post on Facebook saying, "Here I am in Las Vegas, Las Vegas's newest resident. Yesterday it was 86 degrees in the sun. Today it's 48 degrees in rain. Well played, 2020, well played." Okay. I think that he's making a quip there about the weather, and I don't think this guy was really scamming anybody. I think that after doing a year's campaign here in the Pacific Northwest, it's well within your rights to take a trip to Las Vegas, in my opinion. I wish I could have done the same. But he talks about how he has a link to Seattle Times, and then he says, for the source material, check out Gurgen himself in an unhinged Facebook Live that's been viewed over 90,000 times. The front page of the campaign's website, trumpets non-existent voter fraud. Non-existent voter fraud. So this guy, Paul Query, is of the belief that voter fraud is non-existent. It just doesn't exist. He has complete faith in our election process here in Washington State. And I've done a previous stream about this, but I don't. I have to disagree here that we have the mail-in voting, and even President Jimmy Carter did a bipartisan commission back in the early 2000s about mail-in voting and found out that it was just wrought with voter fraud, and that mail-in voting was not dependable as a way to hold an election. And to think that we here in Washington State have been forced through 100% mail-in voting ever since 2005 after the really close governor's race with Dino Rossi and Christine Gregoire, where Christine Gregoire ended up winning the third recount by 129 votes. 129 votes, if you think about that. She ended up winning by such a small margin. They found boxes of ballots in trunks of cars and things like that during the recount process. To say non-existent voter fraud, I mean, that's just a joke. That is not somebody who's serious about analyzing the political process. This guy is a Democrat who's posting hit pieces on Republicans. That's what he's all about. The Washington Observer is all about doing hit pieces on Republicans and kissing up to the Seattle Times. This guy links into and kisses up to the Seattle Times wherever he can. And anybody who thinks the Seattle Times is a viable news source is fooling themselves. The Seattle Times took a look at, I think, 29 races here in Washington State during this campaign season. And of the 29, I think they endorsed 28 Democrats. They are basically a super PAC for the Democrat Party. And I think that I personally think that the Republicans need to stop responding to and stop doing business altogether with the Seattle Times. I think it would probably serve them better if they just didn't participate at all with the Seattle Times, and we need to demand that the Seattle Times is more transparent about their motivations. They are a Democrat operation through and through. They are not a nonpartisan news outlet by any means, by any stretch of the imagination. He says, let's look at Gurgen's background for a bit. He goes into his Oregon campaign for Donald Trump, and he says, but here's the thing, Donald Trump got the worst ass-kicking in Oregon presidential politics since Bob Dole in 1996, pulling in just 39.09% of the vote. At least Dole had Ross Perot as an excuse. Okay, regardless of what percentage Donald Trump got in 2016 in Oregon, is inconsequential. Donald Trump won the election that year. And a lot of people, a vast majority of Republicans believe that he won the election this year, if not for the non-existent voter fraud, as referenced here on the Washington Observer. Gurgen's online persona perhaps inadvertently evokes Billy Bob Thornton's character. In his YouTube video, he grandiosely describes Dark Horse Political as a consultancy working to bring political and economic freedom to the international community. Gurgen's wife is a conservative Bolivian activist, okay? So we can put Bolivia in the loss column as well. So he's racking up losses for Chris Gurgen, and he says, let's look at the money in Culp's race, raised and spent. Spending disclosures for the final days of the campaign isn't due until next month, but we've got a decent picture through late October. As we reported before, Culp got little help from the Republican Party or its usual major donors, and his fundraising among ordinary donors was quite robust. It really took off after he advanced from the primary. Of the $3.1 million raised, he got more than $250,000 from small donors, less than he got from the roughly 100 wealthier donors who gave the maximum of $2,000. More than 28,000 people gave him money, many just a few dollars. If we assume that the money came from the places where he got the most votes, we're talking about some of the poorest and most economically depressed parts of Washington. And as we all know, that's one of the biggest problems here in Washington, is that Jay Inslee's government only plays to big tech. If you work for big tech or for a mega corporation like Boeing, then Jay Inslee's going to take care of you. Jay Inslee's economic policies right now, his economic restrictions and his shutdowns, all favor unfairly his mega wealthy corporate donors that donated in large part to his campaigns, his presidential campaign, where he failed to get even 1% of the national vote in the primaries, and to his statewide campaigns. His restrictions unfairly punish small businesses. We all know that. That's what my Reopen Washington is all about. And it's very obvious to many people. But all this speaks to a robust online fundraising effort. The campaign's PDC disclosure doesn't show much of that, but more than $410,000 was spent with a company called Salience Data for consulting, the campaign's second biggest expense. Salience Data's website has a deliberately secretive black hat hacker feel to it, with no actual people featured. The Observer really hopes that Spy vs. Spy is a reference to the awesome Mad Magazine cartoons of our youth. What a dork! But a little stroll through the Secretary of State's database reveals that the principal of Salience Data is a Marysville realtor named Anton Stetner. Stetner didn't return a message unless you count the bots that are now trying to sell me houses in Snohomish County. So obviously this Salience Data, we can check out their website here, and they have a bunch of information on here. They're not too vague. Obviously, they're all about data-oriented campaigning, whether that's for election reasons, for political campaigns, or any number of things. They do all kinds of stuff, from market development funds, venture capital firms, to investigators, law enforcement and criminal business executives creating market change, research leaders. They do all kinds of stuff. So whatever they have to do with, it has to do with digital marketing. We're in a digital world. Most campaigns are digital. I can't imagine that Jay Inslee didn't spend ungodly amounts of money on data consulting as well. But it goes on to say here, Salience was paid $55,000 on August 21st, more than $25,000 a week from then until late October, and $82,000 on October 23rd. I think that anybody who looks at Culp's campaign would say that the online part of his campaign was a total victory. I mean, he totally blasted every other campaign in the primaries. In the online space, he was the winner, and that's why he ended up being the nominee. Okay, the Republican Party aside, which I did one of my Reopen Washington episodes on the King County Republican Party specifically and their failures, and how I think that they might be secretly run by Democrats, just a little conspiracy theory of my own. But it's clear here that Culp was on his own. He had to run this campaign on his own. He had hardly any help at all from the Republican Party. The Republican Party here in Washington State has in large part failed us. It needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. In my opinion, the Republicans should have unified behind a single candidate in the primary, but instead we had one county endorsing one candidate, we had another county endorsing another candidate. The Republican Party should have united behind somebody, but they didn't. And then when Culp became the nominee, the Republicans just sat down and gave up. And so the establishment Republicans really have failed the party in a lot of ways, and I can go into that in more detail. I have in a previous video where I've talked about the failings of the King County Republican Party and how they didn't host any on-the-ground events. They had 0 events on their Facebook page during the election. Of all of 2020, they had 2 events on their Facebook page leading up to the campaign, and In the month before the campaign, they had 0 events. They didn't have any of the sign-waving events, none of the flag-waving events. They had none of Culp's events listed on there. Their events page was blank and empty. And they left all of the candidates that were officially endorsed, they left them all in the dust. They just left them out there flailing on their own to run their own campaigns. The Republican Party, specifically in King County, did not do any favors to the candidates to help them win. And one telling aspect of this was that on their official website, kcgop.org, they didn't even have the election day on their official calendar on their website. How pathetic is that? So I would say that this money spent on digital data research, data consulting, was money well spent. So going into this article a little more, it says campaign's largest expenditure was for television advertising, $479,000, all of which was to EasyTVSpots.com based in Kent. Now that same TV, EasyTVSpots.com, that was pushed to me as well by the Snohomish County Republican Party as something that I should invest money in, should I have raised enough money to do and justify TV advertising. The third largest line item for the campaign was Gurgen himself, who was paid more than $260,000 in consulting fees and bonuses, along with $60,000 in reimbursed expenses, or more than 10% of the campaign. And that's just the stuff the campaign clearly disclosed. So I don't think 10% is out there. I don't think it's unreasonable at all, especially considering the numbers that I looked at for campaign finance or campaign managers and campaign finance. I think that 10% is pretty reasonable, and I don't think that was anything out of the norm. Just so happens that the Observer knows some political consultants. Ooh. And so we called them to ask how a consultant in Gurgen's position might maximize his haul. Here's the gist. There are 3 basic types of campaigns. Competitive races, we talked about this earlier, in which the winning or losing might actually depend on the quality of the campaign. I think that's the type of race we were in, if you want to ask me. And we get into the vote totals here in just a minute. Structural winners, in which a heavy favorite, usually an incumbent like Jay Inslee, is all but certain to win, and structural losers, in which a candidate has virtually no chance to win. And he talks about competitive races and a structural winner race, and then he says a structural loser, however, is mostly an opportunity to make money, and as much as money as possible. It's even better if you have an inexperienced candidate who hasn't been fully embraced by the party. Gurgen didn't have much help from the state Republican Party. Gee, you think? He didn't have any help from the state Republican Party. But he also likely didn't face much interference either. Another advantage, and I can tell you right now that Chris Gurgen in his Facebook Live that he mentioned here, the Unhinged Facebook Live, where Chris Gurgen here is talking about a lot of the stuff that went on in the campaign, and he talks about how JT Wilcox has attacked Loren Culp and come out against him and that kind of thing. One of the things he talks about, and I can tell you this is true, is that the Republican Party in general didn't have a health plan. They didn't have a jobs plan, and I think that a lot of them are just kind of stuck in the loser mode, the loser mindset, where they are stuck in this mindset of 60+% majority in the Washington state houses, and they don't think there's anything. Why even bother making a jobs plan if the Democrats have a majority in the House and the Senate and they have the governor's mansion? Then why even bother making plans? And I don't think that that's the right frame of mind, and I think that he makes a good point here, saying that they didn't have anything to sell. They had nothing to sell, and as a result, they're all stuck in the loser mindset, in my opinion. But he talks about how, let's see here, most consultants wouldn't have touched Culp with a 10-foot pole. Baloney. Any consultant would have been happy to participate in the Culp campaign, and I think Culp felt he really had a winner in Christopher Gurgen because he was a campaign manager for the Donald Trump campaign in 2016, who, by the way, ended up winning. Whether or not he won Oregon, totally irrelevant. He ended up winning the campaign, and that's why he probably went with this guy, a consultant in that position. And by the way, this guy won the primary. So of all the campaigns, they ran the right campaign. Everybody else was focused on traditional campaigning, and Loren Culp's campaign in the primary, when the whole state was shut down because of restrictions from Jay Inslee's response to the coronavirus, he went around and one of their biggest expenditures, and it's not even mentioned here, one of their largest expenditures in the primary was porta potties. And so they went around toting porta potties and portable stages, and they went around and basically held county fairs all around the state, and that's how they won the primary, because they would go around, hold little rock concerts everywhere, and Loren Culp would gather a bunch of people around and have food vendors, and he'd be able to give his speeches and build up this great ground following and ask everybody to like his campaign pages on Facebook and things like that. And then when it came down to the primary election, Culp had 40,000 people following his page, and every other, the other two top leaders, Joshua Freed, who I voted for, and the other guy, they all had like 10,000 followers on their pages. So, I mean, that was a clear indicator that he was winning. He was winning the campaign in the primary. And so whether or not he won, or whether or not the outcome of the election, you know, this was a successful campaign. And so to say that somehow no other campaign consultant would touch him with a 10-foot pole, that's ridiculous. That's just a ridiculous statement. A consultant in that position could demand an unusually large share of the television ad buy. The going rate is 2 to 3%, but 10% isn't unheard of, which would have added nearly $50,000 to Gurgen's take. He could have extracted kickbacks from vendors throughout the campaign, like taking a bite from everything from yard signs to digital advertising. We'll likely never know just how much of the money flowed from Culp's donors into Gurgen's pocket. He's really making Gurgen out to be a bad guy here. On some levels, the Culp campaign could be reviewed as a success. He got, on some levels, he could be viewed as a success. He got 1.7 million votes, which is far more than any Republican has ever received in a Washington governor's race. Okay, Dino Rossi won the election before the third recount, where he lost by 129 votes. So to say that, to start this whole half of this article with how big of a failure Gurgen is, and then go on to say that he could be viewed as a success. He got over 1.7 million votes, which is far more than any Republican has ever received in a Washington governor's race, and enough to win in every other year except 2016 and 2020. And it's been talked about before. I've talked about it in this stream as well, but the mail-in voting in Washington is a travesty. Kim Wyman has failed us. Okay? And he goes on to talk about nearly 85,000 people follow the campaign's Facebook page. More than 28,000 people liked him enough to reach for their wallets. It's clear his live free or die message resonated in large swaths of rural Washington. It resonated all over Washington, in my opinion. In an alternate universe, Republican office holders would be congratulating Culp on a race well run. I think Culp, one of the things that's not really talked about, especially not in this article, is that he activated a big base of voters that haven't bothered voting because they felt like it was worthless. And I think that if the Republican parties here in the state had unified and supported Loren Culp as they would have supported Raul Garcia or any establishment conservative if he would have won the primary. But in that case, a lot of the base that voted for Loren Culp probably wouldn't have bothered voting again. And so I think if the Republicans had unified and really put their weight behind Loren Culp, we maybe could have pulled it off. But they didn't. And so all we can do is sit here and talk about it after the fact. Inslee spent roughly $8 million. So Loren Culp raised $3.1 million. And Inslee spent roughly $8 million on his own campaign instead of pouring money into close races for the legislature, and certainly reaching out to his followers to bring more of them fully into the party. So I think if the Republicans had stepped up and spent a little money and thrown their total weight behind Loren Culp, maybe we could have gotten close to that $8 million spent that Loren Culp spent on the campaign. Loren Culp had mega donors, and obviously $8 million is nothing to balk at. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. So he more than doubled what Loren Culp raised altogether. So of the 3.1 million raised, obviously all of that didn't get spent on the campaign. There was all kinds of fees, not the least of which are your campaign consultants. But Yeah, Jay Inslee totally outspent Loren Culp. Instead, Gurgen and Culp are pouring gasoline on a Trump-lit fire of false voter fraud. So that's a Trump-lit fire of false voter fraud. Voter fraud is very, very real, especially here in Washington State, where we have 100% mail-in voting. 100%. There are people who got 7 ballots in the mail. There are people who didn't register to vote and got ballots. There are people who are not legally able to vote here in Washington State, and they still got ballots in the mail. There are people who got ballots at old addresses and current addresses. There's We the Governed, the website We the Governed did a great piece on this, and just in King County alone, there's like 6.7 or 7.6% or something like that of voter registration is out of date by years. I mean, there are so many dead people and people who have since moved out of the county that are still on the registered voter registration in King County. It is ridiculous. And the codes here, the laws here in Washington State say that they're supposed to clear those voter registration rolls out, like every year or every other year or something, and they haven't done it in years. 6.7%, whatever the number is, that's a huge number when you talk about outdated voter logs. And all those ballots, anybody who with half a brain knows that the majority of those ballots that are out of date or whatever, they're getting harvested by ballot harvesters, people who are going around in the election season, and they are harvesting ballots for their party, whichever party they're supporting. And I'm sure that voter fraud goes both ways, but we all know that it goes heavily one way. It goes towards the Democrats. And just in the 2004 election, during the recount after recount, when Christine Gregoire ended up winning by 129 votes, they were finding boxes of ballots in the trunks of cars. All kinds of crazy stuff went on back then, and that was when the state was only 40% or 60% mail-in voting. And then one of the first things they did in 2005, following that race, was move the entire state to a mail-in vote state. And then we have this situation where you can't even go and find out who your ballot was counted towards after the fact. So I can go and check and see that my ballot was turned in and counted, but I can't actually see who it was counted towards. Think about that for a second. Okay, so they go on to say that he picks a fight with JT Wilcox and says that he should grow a pair, and threatens to run a primary challenger against him. And the only plausible reason to do any of those things is to keep Culp's supporters fired up and clicking the donate button on his website. And in a few weeks, we'll find out how much they gave and how big of a check the campaign sends to the Dark Horse Political down in Vegas. And one thing we may never know, how much of that money, if any, found its way to Culp himself. Is he grifter or Mark? I mean, give me a break. Give me a break. Trying to cast doubt, and all this article is about is shaming people for supporting Loren Culp and shaming them for being supporters of the Culp campaign in general. And then he goes on to gives a little side note here about the Culp campaign, and then in the bottom of every article on this guy's page, because some of you are only here for a dose of Milo. No, I'm pretty sure that if they were only here for a dose of Milo, they'd go to the Milo section on your stupid website. Nobody cares about your dog when you're posting articles here about, elections and observing Washington and things like that. Several people, give you positive feedback about your doggy pictures here on your website. But what a loser. At the bottom of every article, you've got to post a picture of your dog. I just think it's stupid to have a website all about tracking the money on political campaigns, and then all you can do on the bottom of everything, you got to have this little picture of your dog. Subaru driving Paul Query and his doggy. And then he has another update article that says, the long grift just gets better. Data consultants turns out to be weed data. And Culp paid double for signs. So he talks about how his readers were so smart. I think that the fact that your readers had to come through and find these little additions to your page just shows how crappy of a reporter you actually are, that you couldn't find this stuff out before you published your hit piece. But he says one noticed that the Culp campaign paid roughly twice the going rate for yard signs, about $5 instead of $2 to $3. Every Culp yard sign that I saw came with the metal stake, and I can tell you the metal stake alone costs $1. So $2 to $3. I'm sorry. I looked at the volume pricing for my campaign. I don't think that's legitimate. I don't think that anybody's getting $2 to $3 yard signs, and if they are, the metal stake costs $1 in and of itself. So that alone adds $1 to the price, and paying $5 for a yard sign is not unreasonable. I paid about $8 for every one of my yard signs when you add in the cost for a stake. So if I had ordered really high volume signs, I could have got that down, but I don't think I could have got it down to $5. And I know that there's sign places all over the place, but most sign makers that work for the campaigns are a middleman. They're not actually the person making the sign, and so there's always a middleman markup. And the only way you can get $2 to $3 signs is if you ordered mass quantity and you ordered these crappy paper signs. They don't hold up well in the weather. And then during the summer months, the shiny, glossy paper signs, they are nice in the summer months because they're super cheap, and you can get those for about $3 each. And but what happens is that landscapers pull them out and they toss them into a pile, and then you've got to go drive around, or whoever's in charge of your campaign. In my case, it was me. But if whoever's volunteering or whatever to work on your campaign, they've got to go around and put those signs back up. And when people are pulling those out and throwing them on the ground, and they're getting wet and they're taking on water, those paper signs do not hold up at all. So you end up having to replace the sign, or you just have these tattered looking signs on the street. They don't look very well at all. But the more expensive, the $5 signs, those are the two-sided plastic signs. And I can tell you, Loren Culp signs, my signs were pretty basic. I've got them right here. I paid a little extra to get the red elect there, and I have a little red shadow on my website, Adam4WA. But the three color signs cost more money, and 2 color signs are the cheapest. So if you want to talk about $2 to $3 signs, the only way to get even close to that is to have a 2 color sign where you've got the base color. Vast majority of my signs were one-sided signs. I did that to save money because I was trying to get the biggest number of signs possible. Every Culp sign that I saw, every single one of them was a 2-sided sign with multiple colors, and every little piece, every little addition on the sign adds up. So to squawk about paying average about $5, and I'm sure he's rounding up. I wouldn't doubt for 1 second that this guy's rounding up to $5. But to even say $5 a sign, that is not unreasonable in my opinion. Kickbacks for vendors, yeah. I mean, like I said, every single vendor, every single person involved in the sign making process is a middleman. And he talks about salience data and how they're tied to another business called 421 Holdings, controlled by this other guy, and they're a digital accelerator. And one of the things he accelerates is the weed business. Well, I'm sorry, the marijuana industry here in Washington State is a major, major industry right now. And it's also one of the industries that Jay Inslee has heavily favored, where you could go to church, you couldn't go to church, schools are closed, you couldn't go to the gym, but you could go buy weed all you wanted. The weed stores have never been shut down. They've never been closed. And they didn't have to wear masks until later on in the coronavirus thing. During the phased reopenings, then they started forcing them to wear masks. And so for the first initial shutdown during the March, April, the month-long stay home 2 weeks to slow the spread that ended up being well over a month, that initial shutdown order didn't affect the weed business at all. That was one of the businesses that Jay Inslee favored. So while you couldn't go to church, you couldn't do any number of things, you could go buy weed all you wanted. I mean, imagine that. And so, it's so ridiculous in my opinion. Then they talk about Gurgen's start in politics, but look, there's another doggy picture with your disgusting Subaru. Dude, you couldn't take a better picture of your gross dog. One thing I found interesting about this guy Paul Query running this website, is that he has an article here on October 23rd, just before the election, and he says a cheap lie So it's just a lie, out and out. Obviously, you can tell this guy's politics from how he takes a stand here. He sides with the Seattle Times. He sides with the Democrats on here. He says a cheap lie in the voter pamphlet prompts an expensive campaign to defend the OSPI chief. Maia Espinoza's whopper on the taxpayer's dime draws in $650,000 from the Washington Education Association and other unions to defend Reichdahl. And then he talks about, he says this is a story about how a cheaply told lie can be really expensive to fight. Oh, a cheaply told lie. It was oh, poor Chris Reichdahl. He had to spend all this money, and the Education Association had to spend all this money to defend Chris Reichdahl in this cheap little lie. And what's the lie, you ask? But it says the incumbent ignored parents and educators by championing a policy that teaches sexual positions to fourth graders. Oh, what a half-truth. I can't believe that Maia Espinoza would tell such a whopper of a lie. Unbelievable. Gee. And then he talks about, I'll refer you to Dahlia Baza's takeout, which is a link to the Seattle Times on the race. And the Seattle Times, we know, is a total Democrat machine. They're not impartial at all. But the short version, it's flat out false. Flat out false, huh? Let's just look into that a little bit. And he talks about, what's interesting here is he talks about how in response to this lie, the Washington Education Association had to dump a bunch of money into the campaign to defend Chris Reichdahl. And he goes on and on and on about how Maia Espinoza lied and blah, blah, blah. And it says, a few days after they spent a ton of money to defend this guy, a few days later, a new PAC, a new political action committee, Strong Public Schools, was created and seeded with $500,000 from the Washington Education Association and another $150,000 from several other union-backed PACs. That's 10 times what the WEA spent on an independent campaign supporting Reichdahl in 2016. They had to spend 10 times the amount of money in 2020 to get this guy reelected. That's how sick this was. And I personally, I think we should get this money out of politics. I do not think that this is a good idea, that they should be able to just dump, millions of dollars into, or hundreds of thousands of dollars into these campaigns to support their candidate, when this is supposed to be a nonpartisan position. And he says here, it's a nonpartisan office. So there were no handy labels to guide voters. Voters, they're just so incapable of making a decision on their own. There was no handy little labels to guide the voters. And so as a result, they had to dump all this money to defend the lie. And here we can see, here on Reopen Washington State public group, I've got the files listed here. I uploaded these files to the group, and these are from the curriculum that Chris Reichdahl supports as part of the mandated sex ed curriculum. And let's just look at this whopper of a lie here and see exactly what he's talking about. Okay, so here we have the curriculum, and this is 3 R's, grades K through 4, examples. This is examples of the curriculum for grades K through 4. Now let's remember what the lie was here. The incumbent ignored parents and educators by championing a policy that teaches sexual positions to 4th graders. Okay, let's close that out. Here we are. This is the 3 R's, examples of the curriculum supported by Chris Reichdahl in his mandated sex ed curriculum. And this is specifically a lesson plan from Rights, Respect, and Responsibility, a K through 12 curriculum. And this is specifically the K through 4, kindergarten through 4th grade. The lie was teaching sexual positions to 4th graders. Now let's go ahead and go down here, go down the list. There's all kinds of stuff here, and it goes in detail for fourth graders. It goes in detail in a lot of this stuff. And it's a little NSFW in my opinion, but my kid, we were very upfront with him from a young age, so any of this stuff is not a surprise. But to get so graphic in the curriculum, especially for fourth graders, I think is pretty disgusting. And I think that this should be left up to the parents. And I can tell you that as a foster parent, there are a lot of kids out there that don't have parents to teach them the sex education things that a lot of us think should be left up to the parents. And I think that an easy solution would be to say, hey, parents have to certify, they're going to sign off, that they've discussed certain topics with their kids, whatever. But it says here, go down, talks about gender roles. There's all kinds of gross stuff in here, and I'm not going to get into all of it. But if you keep going down, here we have a whole section for kindergarten through fourth grade, mind you. It has a parental advisory explicit content warning on here. Sexual intercourse, okay? And look, you've got men and women in bed. You've got people masturbating. So you've got a woman here. You got a guy here. Look, you got two guys doing it in bed. You got two guys there. And so I can tell you right here, this constitutes teaching sexual positions to fourth graders, in my opinion. Sexual intercourse, having sex, can involve the penis, the vagina, or the mouth and the genitals, or the penis and the anus. And then it has all these different, and it repeats the gay stuff. The two guys, it repeats it here, and then it repeats the same thing on this page. And if this is not teaching sexual positions to fourth graders, then I don't know what is. And I think that this could be the reason, this could be in part one of the reasons that the Supreme Court sided with Maia Espinoza on the fact that this is what it is, teaching positions to fourth graders. And for anybody to say that this is a lie only shows their bias. This is not a lie. This is the truth, and it's 100% accurate. And to say that that this is a lie is a lie. He is the liar here. Paul Query is the liar. Okay, this guy is a Democrat hack. He is a total hack. He puts out hit pieces on Republicans. That's what he does. The description of his website: veteran political journalist, recovering hired communications gun, writing about politics, government, and the influence thereof in Washington State. No, this guy is a Democrat who puts out hit pieces on Republicans. That's what the Washington Observer is. The Washington Observer is fake news. He's a wannabe reporter. He wants to be on the level of the Seattle Times. He kisses up to them and links to them in almost every article. He links to the Seattle Times, which is one of the biggest fake news sources here in Washington State. This guy is nothing but a Democrat tool that puts out hit pieces on Republicans. So anybody who sees this piece about Culp's campaign, looks like the long con, he's purely trying to shame people, and specifically because Culp has not resigned, and the campaign is trying really hard to investigate voter fraud here in Washington State and hopefully expose what is actually going on. We need paper ballots. We need in-person voting. We need people to show up and vote in person and show an ID. That's what we need. We need real reform here in Washington State. We need to rebuild the Republican Party from the ground up, and we need to fight against this garbage system that we have of forced mail-in voting, because it does not work. It has resulted in a Democrat lock on our state, and they are pushing really hard for an even larger majority so they can get past the constitutional restrictions on passing legislation and passing budgets and things like that, where they require a 60% majority. That's what they're pushing towards. And one of the things that I was labeled with in the campaign was I was against new sources of revenue. And they want to increase taxes. They want to introduce new taxes like a capital gains tax and an income tax. They are trying their hardest. They're going to do their damnedest to institute an income tax. And they want to get past those restrictions on budgetary requirements with 60% majority and things like that. And they're doing their best to get around that. And it's only a matter of time, folks. It's only a matter of time before they have what they need to circumvent those rules and do an end run around our Constitution and then institute an income tax. That's what's coming down the pike. And I'm just going to go ahead and end this stream with some pictures of my dogs. Just like Paul Query, aspiring reporter. You know, got some cute little doggies here, and some people I know you're only here for a little piece of Neville, a little bit of Nevillesaurus, and so that's why you're here. You're not here for the political discussion. You're only here for the dog. And oh, little Neville there. Oh, look at that. What a funny dog. Oh, what a cutie. Thanks for tuning in, and hope you'll share this stream, share this video. Please like my page, and you can find this on youtube.com/lifeisdriving. Thanks for tuning in.